The rain had stopped 3 hours before the funeral, but the earth remembered. It remembered in the way mud sucked at boots and the way water pooled in the fresh-cut grave, turning the bottom into a mirror that reflected nothing but gray sky. Lenora Whitmore stood at the edge of that grave, 21 years old, wearing a black dress borrowed from a neighbor because she owned nothing suitable for bearing a husband. She had been married for 11 months. The minister spoke words she could not hear. Something about dust and ashes, something about the Lord giving and the Lord taking away. The words floated past her like leaves on a stream, touching nothing, changing nothing. Tobias was in the pine box at the bottom of that muddy hole, and no amount of scripture would bring him back. The handful of mourners shifted their weight from foot to foot. Farmers, mostly men who had worked alongside Tobias when he first arrived in the valley before he bought the quarry, and started talking about granite and futures and building something that would last. Their wives stood behind them, faces arranged in expressions of appropriate sympathy, eyes already calculating how long they would need to stay before they could return to their warm kitchens and their living husbands. Lenora noticed none of them. She was looking at the hole in the ground, thinking about another hole, a bigger hole, a hole that had swallowed all their savings and all their dreams, and now it seemed had swallowed Tobias himself. The quarry, 30 feet deep and 60 feet across, cut into the Vermont granite by men who had worked it for 15 years before the vein ran thin and the owners moved on. Tobias had bought it for $200 every cent they had because he saw something in that abandoned pit that no one else could see. Now Tobias was dead, and Lenora was alone with a flooded hole and a future that looked as dark as the water at the bottom of the quarry. The minister finished speaking. Someone touched her elbow. She was supposed to throw dirt on the coffin, she realized. That was what widows did. They threw dirt on the men they loved, and then they walked away, and somehow they kept living, even though the walking and the living felt impossible. She bent down, took a handful of wet earth, felt it cold and heavy in her palm. She held it over the grave, over the pine box that held what remained of Tobias Whitmore, and she thought about the last time she had seen him alive. He had been standing at the edge of the quarry, looking down at the water with that expression he got when he was working through a problem in his head. His hair had been wet with mist, his boots muddy, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. She had called to him from the cabin door, telling him supper was ready, and he had turned and smiled at her, and his smile had been so full of hope that she had smiled back despite the cold and the damp and the growing certainty that they had made a terrible mistake coming to Vermont. That was the last time she saw him alive, the last time she saw him smile. She opened her hand and let the dirt fall. The sound it made hitting the coffin was the loneliest sound she had ever heard. The mourners dispersed quickly after the burial, mumbling condolences that meant nothing and making promises to visit that they would never keep. Lenora walked back to the cabin alone, following the muddy track that wound through the pines, moving like a woman in a dream. The cabin came into view through the trees, small, rough-hewn, barely finished. Tobias had built it with his own hands in the weeks after they arrived, working from dawn to dusk because they needed shelter before the winter came. He had never finished the porch railing. She noticed that now, looking at the cabin with eyes that suddenly saw everything too clearly. The railing was half complete, the posts set, but the rails not yet attached. Tobias had meant to finish it. He had meant to do a lot of things. She went inside and sat at the table he had built in the chair he had made, and she stared at the wall until the light faded and the cabin filled with shadows. She did not light a lamp. She did not eat. She simply sat in the darkness and tried to understand how her life had collapsed so completely in so short a time. 11 months ago, she had been Lenora Ashby, living in Massachusetts, working as a seamstress in her aunt's shop. She had been content, if not happy. She had expected to live out her days in that small coastal town, sewing dresses for other women's weddings, watching other people's lives unfold, while her own remained still and quiet as a pond without wind. Then Tobias Whitmore had walked into the shop to have a tear repaired in his coat, and everything had changed. He was not a handsome man, not in the way the poets wrote about. His face was too angular, his nose slightly crooked from a childhood fall, his hair the color of wet sand. But his eyes were the color of granite, and when he looked at her, she felt like he was seeing something in her that no one else had ever noticed. He came back the next day claiming another tear, and the day after that. On the fourth day, he stopped pretending and simply asked if she would walk with him along the harbor. They were married 6 weeks later. Tobias talked about Vermont the way some men talked about gold or women or Gua. He had been there as a young man working in the granite quarries, and he had never forgotten the stone. The way it held temperature, he said, the way it lasted. Granite was forever. Granite was the future. The cities were growing, and they all needed stone. And the man who controlled a quarry controlled his own destiny. He had saved for years working odd jobs, putting away every penny, dreaming of the day he could buy a quarry of his own. And now he had found one. Abandoned, yes. Flooded, certainly. But the granite was still there, waiting beneath the water. All they had to do was drain it, and they would have something of their own. Something that would last. Lenore had believed him. She had believed in his eyes and his voice, in the certainty that radiated from him like heat from a stove. She had left everything she knew, followed him to this remote Vermont valley, helped him build the cabin with her own hands, and watched him walk to the quarry every day, studying it, planning, dreaming. And then he had slipped on the wet rocks at the quarry's edge and fallen 30 feet to the water below. They found his body floating face down 3 days later after she had walked to the nearest farm to report him missing. The doctor said he had hit his head on the way down. He never felt a thing, the doctor said, as if that were some kind of comfort. As if knowing that Tobias had died instantly was supposed to make the dying acceptable. Lenora sat in the darkness of the cabin and listened to the wind moving through the pines, and she understood that she was completely and utterly alone. 3 days after the funeral, Horace Pembroke came calling. Lenore was in the cabin trying to sort through Tobias's belongings when she heard the horse approaching. She went to the window and watched a tall figure dismounting, a man in a fine coat with silver hair slicked back and a ruby stick pin glinting at his throat. He moved with the careful precision of someone who was accustomed to being watched and admired. She opened the door before he could knock. Horace Pembroke was 55 years old, though he looked older. His face was weathered in the way of men who spent too much time indoors acquiring a pallor that no amount of sunlight seemed to cure. His eyes were pale blue and calculating, the eyes of a man who looked at everything and everyone as potential transactions. He had made his fortune buying distressed properties and selling them at profit, and the valley knew him as both a businessman and a vulture, depending on whether you owed him money. He removed his hat and smiled, showing teeth that were too white and too even. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "please accept my condolences on the loss of your husband." Tobias was a man of considerable optimism. The way he said the word optimism made it sound like a disease. "Thank you, Mr. Pembroke." She did not invite him inside. His smile did not waver. "I've come to discuss a matter of business. Might I have a moment of your time?" "I'm not interested in business." "I think you might be interested in this." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet. From the wallet, he extracted a small stack of bills. $12 for the quarry. Lenora stared at the money in his hand. $12. 3 months of careful spending. Enough for a train ticket back to Massachusetts and a few weeks of boarding while she looked for work. Enough to start over, to leave this place and all its memories behind. "The quarry," she repeated. "That flooded pit your husband purchased. I'm prepared to take it off your hands, spare you the burdenness of owning something worthless." There was satisfaction in his voice. She heard it clearly, the pleasure of a man who had waited for this moment, who had perhaps known it was coming from the very beginning. Tobias paid $200 for that quarry. Tobias paid $200 for a working quarry. Pembroke's smile took on an edge. What you have now is a flooded hole that produces nothing but mosquitoes. The granite is 30 feet underwater and likely to remain there forever. No one in their right mind would pay more than I'm offering. Then why are you offering anything at all? The question seemed to catch him off guard. His smile flickered just for a moment, and she saw something underneath. Something cold and calculating and patient. Call it charity, he said. A widow alone in a place like this. You need options, Mrs. Whitmore. Take the $12. Buy yourself a train ticket back to Massachusetts. Go back to wherever you came from. He paused and his smile returned harder than before. There's nothing for you here. Lenora looked at the money in his hand. She looked at his pale eyes and his ruby stick pin and his fine coat that cost more than everything she owned. She thought about Tobias, who had believed in the quarry, who had seen something in that flooded pit that no one else could see. She thought about his smile at the edge of the water, full of hope. No, she said. Pembroke's eyebrows rose. No, the quarry is not for sale. Mrs. Whitmore, I don't think you understand your situation. You have no money, no prospects, and winter is coming. That quarry will never produce a single block of granite. It will sit there flooded and useless until the day you die, and then it will pass to the county for unpaid taxes. Take my offer. It's more than fair. It's $12. It's more than this property is worth. Lenora stepped back and put her hand on the door. Good day, Mr. Pembroke. His face changed. The mask of pleasantry slipped away, revealing something ugly underneath. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. For just a moment, she saw the man behind the businessman, and that man was not accustomed to being refused. Your husband was a fool, he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, but there was poison in it. He bought a hole in the ground that will never amount to anything, and he died in it like the fool he was. God rest his soul. The last words were a mockery, and they both knew it. Don't make his mistake. Don't be a fool yourself. Leave my property. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he replaced his hat, tucked the money back into his wallet, and turned toward his horse. He mounted with the ease of long practice and looked down at her from the saddle. I'll be back, he said, when you're ready to see sense. When the winter has reminded you what it means to be alone in a place like this. I'll be back, Mrs. Whitmore, and my offer will be lower. He turned the horse and rode away through the pines, his back straight and his head high. Lenora watched until he disappeared around the bend in the track, and then she closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard, trembling with an emotion she couldn't name. Anger, perhaps, or fear, or something else entirely. She had just refused $12 for a flooded quarry in a place where she knew no one and had nothing. She had just told the richest man in the valley that she would not do what he wanted. She had just made an enemy, and she had no idea what she was going to do next. The next morning, Lenora went to the quarry. She had been avoiding it since Tobias's death. The quarry was where he had died, and she had not been able to face it. But Pembroke's visit had changed something in her. His contempt for her, his certainty that she would fail his assumption that she had no choice but to take his charity and run. It had awakened something in her that she had thought was dead. She was angry. The quarry was a 20-minute walk from the cabin, following a path that Tobias had worn through the underbrush over months of daily trips. The autumn leaves were turning now red and gold and orange, and they crunched beneath her boots as she walked. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the smell of pine and wood smoke from distant farms. She heard the quarry before she saw it. Or rather, she heard the silence of it. The forest sounds faded as she approached the bird's song and the rustling of small animals giving way to a stillness that seemed unnatural. The quarry created its own atmosphere, she realized. A pocket of quiet carved into the hillside. She came around the last bend in the path, and there it was. The quarry was a wound in the earth, a rectangular pit cut into the granite hillside by men who had worked it for 15 years. The walls were sheer faces of gray stone, smooth, where the blocks had been cut rough, where the rock had simply broken away. They rose 30 feet from the water to the rim, massive and silent and ancient, utterly indifferent to the tiny human standing at their edge. The water filled the bottom like a dark mirror, reflecting the October sky. It was still and black and revealed nothing of what lay beneath. 12 feet deep, Tobias had estimated accumulated over a decade of abandonment. 12 feet of water separating the surface from the granite floor below. Lenora stood at the eastern edge and looked down at the water that had killed her husband. She did not know what she had expected to feel. Grief, perhaps, or horror, or the desperate desire to flee that Pembroke seemed to think she should feel. But standing there looking at the floated quarry, she felt only stillness. The same stillness that hung in the air that seemed to radiate from the stone walls that turned the quarry into a place outside of time. This was where Tobias had died. But it was also where he had dreamed. Day after day, he had come to this spot looking at the water, planning how to get past it to the granite below. He had seen something in this flooded pit that no one else could see. He had believed in it enough to spend every cent they had enough to uproot their lives and move across states enough to trying to make his vision real. What had he seen? She walked slowly around the rim of the quarry, studying it the way she imagined Tobias must have studied it. The walls were remarkably uniform, straight vertical faces of gray granite with hardly a ledge or projection. The men who had cut this stone had known their craft. They had extracted block after block of perfect granite, leaving behind a pit that was almost geometrically precise. Almost. On the eastern side where she was standing, there was a slight irregularity in the wall. Not a crack exactly, but a seam in the rock where two different formations met. The stone on either side was solid, but at the junction, there was a narrow gap barely visible unless you were looking for it, and the water was lower here. Lenora froze, staring at the waterline. On the western side of the quarry, the water lapped against the stone perhaps 2 feet below the level of the surrounding ground. But here on the eastern side, it was lower. Not by much. 6 inches, maybe 8, but definitely lower. She looked at the seam in the rock. She looked at the lower water line, and she felt something click into place in her mind, a connection that seemed so obvious now that she couldn't understand why she hadn't seen it immediately. The water was draining. Somewhere in that seam, somewhere in the gap between the two formations, there was a crack, a fissure in the granite that was allowing water to seep through to wherever water went when it drained from high places. The quarry was emptying itself slowly, imperceptibly, leaking through the eastern wall into the earth below, which meant the quarry could be drained. The realization hit her like a physical blow. If the water was already seeping through a crack, then the crack could be widened. The seep could become a flow. The flow could become a flood, and eventually, day by day, week by week, the water could be drained from the quarry entirely. And if the quarry was drained, the granite floor would be exposed. She stood at the edge of the pit, heart pounding, mind racing. Tobias had seen this. He must have seen this. The lower water line on the eastern side, the seam in the rock, the possibility hidden in what everyone else dismissed as a flooded ruin. This was what he had been planning. This was what he had been dreaming about when he stood here every day staring at the water. This was what had been worth $200. She thought about Horace Pembroke and his $12. She thought about his contempt, his certainty that the quarry was worthless, his assumption that she had no choice but to accept defeat and retreat. He had called Tobias a fool. He had called the quarry a flooded hole that produced nothing but mosquitoes. But what if he was wrong? What if Tobias was right all along? Finding old Salvatore was not difficult. Everyone in the valley knew where to find the old Italian stone cutter who had worked the quarries for 30 years before his back gave out and his hands began to shake. He lived in a shack at the edge of the village, a structure barely more substantial than a lean-to surrounded by blocks of granite that he had collected over the decades like other men collected memories. Lenora found him sitting on a stump outside the shack, whittling a piece of pine with a knife that caught the afternoon light. He was 72 years old, his face creased with lines that mapped decades of squinting against stone dust and sunlight. His hands more callous than skin. His hair was cropped close to his skull, gray as the granite that had been his life's work, and his eyes when he looked up at her approach were still sharp with an intelligence that age had not dimmed. "You are the Whitmore widow," he said. His accent was thick, the vowels rounded by the language of his birth. He had come to Vermont in 1824, drawn by the granite boom that was only beginning, and he had never fully abandoned the rhythms of Italy. "I heard about your husband, a bad business. You knew Tobias." "I knew of him. He came to me once asking questions about the old quarry, the one he bought from Pembroke." Salvatore's eyes narrowed slightly. "Pembroke sold it to him. Did you know that? Sold it for $200, knowing it would flood, knowing the vein had run thin, knowing your husband would buying nothing but disappointment. Pembroke has been waiting for this, waiting for your husband to fail so he could buy it back for pennies." The words hit Lenora like stones. Pembroke had sold them the quarry. Pembroke had known it was worthless. Pembroke had set them up to fail from the very beginning, and now he was circling like a vulture waiting to scoop up the remains. "Why?" she whispered. "Because that's what Pembroke does." Salvatore returned to his whittling the knife, moving with slow precision, despite the slight tremor in his hands. "He finds desperate people, sells them dreams, and then buys back the wreckage when the dreams fall apart. Your husband was not the first. He will not be the last." Lenora felt the anger rising in her again, hot and sharp. She thought about Pembroke standing at her door with his $12 and his condescending smile. She thought about Tobias, who had believed so completely in the quarry, who had seen it as their future, their freedom. Pembroke had sold them a trap, and Tobias had walked straight into it. But Tobias had also seen something, something real. "The quarry," she said. "You worked there. You cut stone from it. For 8 years. Good granite, clean grain. Worth a fortune if anyone could get to it." He looked up at her again, and there was something in his eyes now, a spark of interest. "Why do you ask?" "Because I want to drain it. I want to see what's at the bottom." Salvatore stopped whittling. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his face unreadable. Then he set down the knife and the piece of pine, and he folded his hands in his lap, and he looked at her with an expression that was equal parts assessment and respect. "The bottom is granite," he said slowly. "Flat as a table, smooth as a floor. We cut it that way on purpose so the blocks would sit level before we lifted them out. It is still there under the water waiting." He paused. "Why do you want to see it?" "Because I think I can live there." The words sounded insane even as she spoke them. Live at the bottom of a quarry, build a home in a hole in the ground. It was madness, the desperate fantasy of a woman with no options and nothing to lose. She expected Salvatore to laugh at her or to look at her with the same contempt that Pembroke had shown. But he did not laugh. And there was no contempt in his eyes. Instead, he smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible beneath the weathered landscape of his face, but it was genuine. It was the smile of a man who had seen something unexpected, something that pleased him. "You are not as foolish as Pembroke thinks," he said. "A quarry is just a room with no roof. 30 feet of granite walls, a granite floor, granite all around." He leaned forward and his voice dropped to something almost conspiratorial. "You know what temperature it is at the bottom of that quarry?" Lenora shook her head. 50 degrees, summer and winter, day and night. 50 degrees because granite holds temperature like nothing else on earth. The stone remembers the heat of the summer and releases it in winter. It remembers the cold of winter and releases it in summer. It stays the same year after year, decade after decade, while the world above freezes and thaws and freezes again. He stood up, his joints creaking, and he walked to the edge of his collection of granite blocks. He put his hand on one of them, palm flat against the stone, and his eyes went distant. "You drain that quarry," he said. "You build a shelter at the bottom. You will have the warmest home in Vermont. The stone will do all the work." Lenora felt something shifting and some balance tilting from despair toward hope. "Will you help me?" Salvatore was quiet for a long time. He kept his hand on the stone, feeling its coolness, and his eyes stayed distant. She could see him thinking, weighing considerations she could not guess, measuring costs and benefits that existed only in his mind. "I am 72 years old," he said finally. "My back is broken and my hands shake too badly to hold a chisel. I cannot cut stone anymore. I cannot climb down into a quarry. I am not the man I was." "I'm not asking you to cut stone. I'm asking you to teach me, to show me what you know, to help me see what Tobias saw." He turned to look at her then, and something passed between them, a recognition, an understanding. She saw it in his eyes, the memory of his own youth, his own dreams, his own arrival in this valley 50 years ago with nothing but his skills and his determination. He saw in her something that he had once been. "Pembroke will try to stop you," he said. "He wants that land. He always has. The quarry sits on a hill that overlooks the valley. Beautiful land, valuable land. He sold it to your husband so he could buy it back cheap when your husband failed. He will not let you succeed without a fight." "I know. The work will be brutal. Draining a quarry is not a job for one person. It takes teams of men, weeks of labor. You will be doing it alone with nothing but your own hands and whatever tools you can borrow or buy." "I know. And even if you succeed, even if you drain the water and build a shelter at the bottom, people will think you are mad. They will call you the crazy widow who lives in a hole. They will pity you or mock you or both. I don't care what they think." Salvatore studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded a single decisive movement of his head. "Come to the quarry tomorrow at dawn," he said. "I will show you where to begin." The work began the next morning and continued for 6 weeks. Lenora found the crack on the eastern side, right where she had expected it. The seam in the granite was narrow, barely wide enough to fit her hand, but when she pressed her palm against the stone, she could feel the cold breath of moving water. The quarry was already draining through this fissure, seeping into the lower aquifer beneath the hill. All she had to do was make the seep faster. She started with a pickaxe borrowed from a farmer who owed her nothing and expected nothing in return. He gave it to her with the same expression he might have worn while handing a shovel to a lunatic, pity mixed with bewilderment, and beneath both a flicker of fascination at watching someone do something monumentally foolish. The first day she barely made a dent. The granite was harder than anything she had ever encountered, harder than wood, harder than iron, harder than the frozen earth she had watched men struggle to dig for Tobias's grave. Every swing of the pickaxe sent shocks up through her arms and into her shoulders. Every impact felt like hitting a wall that would never yield. By noon, her hands were blistered. By evening, the blisters had burst, and her palms were raw and bleeding. She had widened the crack by perhaps an inch. Salvatore was waiting at the rim when she climbed out, sitting on a boulder, with his face turned toward the westering sun. He said nothing as she emerged, dripping with the quarry water and trembling with exhaustion. He simply looked at her hands, at the blood crusting on her palms, and nodded. "You came back," he said. "Most would not have come back. I don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. You chose to come back. That is something." He taught her how to wrap her hands to protect them, strips of cloth wound tight around the palms and between the fingers. He taught her how to read the grain of the granite, to see the natural lines of weakness, where the rock would split cleanly if struck at the right angle. He taught her where to swing and where not to swing, how to let the weight of the pickaxe do the work, how to conserve her strength for the hours of labor still ahead. Most days no one else came. The people of the valley had written off the quarry, written off Lenora, decided that a widow with a flooded pit wasn't worth her time. They had their own farms to tend their own families, to feed their own lives, to live. They could not afford to waste time watching a mad woman beat her hands bloody against stone. But Salvatore came when he could. He sat on his boulder at the rim, calling down advice about where to strike, how to angle the pickaxe where the rock would yield and where it would fight back. His voice echoed off the granite walls, mixing with the sound of her pickaxe striking stone, creating a rhythm that became the heartbeat of her days. By the third week, the trickle had become a stream. Water no longer seeped through the crack, it flowed. She could see it now, a ribbon of dark water pouring through the widened fissure, disappearing into the darkness below the quarry floor. The sound of it filled the pit, a constant rushing that seemed to promise progress, to promise that her labor was accomplishing something. The water level dropped a foot. By the fourth week, the stream had become a rush. Water poured through the channel she had created, a torrent that carved its own path into the softer stone beneath the granite, finding its way to the aquifer below. The water level dropped 2 feet a day, then 3. The quarry was emptying itself, releasing the flood that had filled it for a decade, revealing more and more of the granite walls with each passing day. Lenora watched the water recede like a tide going out, and she felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. On the morning of the 6th week, she descended the rope ladder she had rigged to the eastern wall and set foot on the quarry floor for the first time. The granite was exactly as Salvatore had described: flat as a table, smooth as a floor, stretching 40 feet wide and 60 feet long. The men who had cut this stone had known their craft. They had left behind a surface so level that water pooled in only a few low spots, so smooth that she could have rolled a marble from one end to the other. The walls rose 30 feet on all sides, sheer faces of gray granite that blocked the wind from every direction. Standing at the bottom, looking up at the rectangle of sky far above, Lenora felt like she was standing in a room, a vast, roofless room carved from the living rock of the Vermont hillside. And it was warm, not warm exactly, cool, but not cold. Not the bitter cold of the October air above. The temperature at the bottom of the quarry was different, gentler, constant. 50 degrees, just as Salvatore had said. The granite walls radiated a steady warmth that seemed to come from the stone itself, from the deep memory of summers past, from heat stored and released in an endless cycle that no winter could break. She stood in the center of the quarry floor, surrounded by granite, and she understood at last what Tobias had seen. This was not a pit. This was not a hole. This was not a flooded ruin or a worthless burden or a foolish dream. This was a home. Lenora found the ring on the third day after the floor was exposed. She was clearing debris from the northwest corner, moving loose stones and accumulated sediment to the drainage channel she had created, when her hand closed on something small and hard and round. She pulled it from the muck and wiped it clean on her skirt, and she saw the glint of gold in the gray afternoon light. Tobias's wedding ring. It must have come off when he fell, or when they pulled his body from the water, or sometime in the 3 days he had floated face down in the flooded quarry waiting to be found. She had not noticed it was missing. She had been too stunned by grief, too overwhelmed by the logistics of death and burial and survival to think about something as small as a ring. But here it was, returned to her by the quarry, by the draining water, by the process she had set in motion. She held the ring in her palm and looked at it, the small circle of gold that Tobias had worn for 11 months. She thought about the day she had put it on his finger, standing in the small church in Massachusetts, her heart so full of hope that she thought it might burst. She thought about his hands, strong and calloused from labor, gentle when they touched her face. She thought about all the things they had planned, all the dreams they had shared, all the futures that had died with him on the rocks at the bottom of this pit. And she cried. For the first time since the funeral, she wept. Not the quiet tears of shock and numbness that had leaked from her eyes in the days after his death. Real tears, loud, ugly, uncontrollable sobbing that echoed off the granite walls and came back to her as a chorus of grief. She sank to her knees on the cold stone floor, and she let herself feel what she had been refusing to feel since the moment she learned he was gone. She missed him. God, she missed him. She missed his voice and his smile and the way he believed in things. She missed the future they had planned, the children they had talked about, the life they had imagined building together in this place. She missed the simple fact of not being alone, of having someone who chose her, who wanted her, who saw something in her worth loving. He was gone. He was never coming back. And she was here, kneeling in the mud at the bottom of a hole, holding his ring and weeping like the world was ending. Because for her, it had ended. 11 months of marriage and it was over. 21 years old, and she was a widow. Everything she had planned, everything she had hoped for, everything she had believed about her life and her future, all of it was gone, washed away, like the water that had filled this quarry drained into the darkness below. She wept until she had no tears left. She wept until her chest ached, and her throat was raw, and her eyes felt like they had been scoured with sand. And when she was done, when she had emptied herself of grief the way she had emptied the quarry of water, she looked up at the granite wall surrounding her, and she made a decision. She would finish what Tobias started. Not for him, not anymore. For herself. She would build a home at the bottom of this quarry. She would prove Horace Pembroke wrong. She would show everyone who had dismissed her, everyone who had pitied her, everyone who had expected her to fail and flee, that Lenora Whitmore was not a woman who gave up. She slipped the ring onto a cord around her neck next to her heart. She climbed to her feet. She wiped her face with hands still dirty from clearing debris, and she went back to work. The shelter took shape over the following weeks, rising against the north wall of the quarry, where the granite face would block the worst of the winter winds. Lenora built the walls from logs. She felt herself cutting down pines from the hillside above the quarry and dragging them to the rim with ropes. The work was back-breaking the logs, heavy and awkward, the distance seemingly endless. But each log that reached the rim was one step closer to shelter. Each log that descended the zigzag path she had cut into the quarry wall was one more piece of the home she was building. Salvatore came nearly every day now. His body would not allow him to climb down into the quarry, but his mind was as sharp as ever, and his voice carried clearly from the rim to the floor below. He told her how to notch the logs so they would lock together at the corners. He taught her how to chink the gaps with moss and clay, sealing the walls against drafts. He explained the principles of construction that he had learned over 50 years of building, and she absorbed every word like a woman dying of thirst. The walls rose 8 feet from the granite floor, solid and tight. The roof came next pitched to shed rain and snow planks covered with tar paper and then set. Heavy enough to stay put in the strongest wind, Salvatore assured her. Heavy enough to last. The chimney was the key. Salvatore showed her how to build it from flat stones, fitting them together without mortar, creating a flue that would draw perfectly because the quarry walls created a natural updraft. Air warming at the bottom of the pit rose along the granite faces, pulling smoke up and out while fresh air flowed down to feed the fire. She built the chimney stone by stone, each flat piece carefully selected and placed. And when she lit the first fire in the hearth she had constructed, the smoke rose straight and true, never backing, never clogging, never failing to draw. The shelter was 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, bigger than the cabin she and Tobias had built above, bigger than any house she had lived in back in Massachusetts. She built a sleeping loft at one end, a cooking area at the other, storage along the walls, furniture from logs and planks, a bed, a table, chairs, shelves for the supplies she would need to survive the winter. But she didn't stop there. Against the south wall, she built a second shelter, smaller than the first, designed for storage. Against the east wall, a third shelter, smaller still, designed for animals. She bought 2 goats from a farmer who was leaving for Ohio, a man glad to take cash money for livestock he couldn't bring with him. The goats would provide milk and eventually meat. They would be company in the long winter months. They would be proof that life could thrive at the bottom of the quarry. She replaced the rope ladder with wooden stairs zigzagging down the quarry wall, sturdy enough to bear weight, safe enough to use in any weather. She built a platform at the top with a small shed that blocked rain and snow from falling directly into the quarry below. By the time the first snow fell in November, Lenora had created something no one in the valley had ever seen, a homestead at the bottom of a hole, protected by 30 feet of granite on every side, heated by the constant temperature of the stone itself. Word spread through the valley about the Whitmore widow living in the quarry. Some people thought she had gone mad with grief over Tobias's death. Others thought she was simply waiting to die, too proud to admit that Pembroke had been right about the worthless pit. A few came to see for themselves, descending the wooden stairs into the quarry, expecting to find a desperate woman huddled in a stone prison. Instead, they found warmth. The bottom of the quarry was protected from the wind, surrounded by granite that radiated 50 degrees no matter what the weather did above. Lenora's shelter was comfortable on a fraction of the firewood that the cabins above were burning. Her goats were healthy in their stone-walled pen. Her stores were safe in the storage shelter that stayed naturally cool. She was not just surviving, she was thriving in a place everyone had said was worthless. The visitors climbed back up the wooden stairs with expressions of wonder on their faces. They told their neighbors what they had seen. The neighbors told their families. The story of the widow in the quarry spread from farm to farm, from village to village, growing with each telling until it became something almost like legend. Horace Pembroke heard the stories and he scoffed. "She's living in a hole like an animal," he told anyone who would listen. His voice carried the certainty of a man who was never wrong, who had built his fortune on being smarter than everyone else. "She'll flood when the spring melt comes if she doesn't freeze first. I give her until February, March at the latest." But December came and Lenore didn't freeze. January came and the quarry stayed dry. The drainage channel she had cut carried away any water that seeped in, sending it to the aquifer below. The temperature at the bottom held steady at 50 degrees, rising to 65 when she had a fire burning, while the world above dropped to 20 below and stayed there. The firewood she had gathered lasted twice as long as she had expected. The goats gave milk even in the coldest months. The stores in her cool shelter kept without spoiling. The granite walls blocked every gust of wind, every driving snow, every bitter blast that sent other families huddling around their stoves and praying for spring. Lenora Whitmore had done what no one believed possible. She had turned a flooded pit into a home. So, the blizzard started on February 3rd, 1855. Lenora woke that morning to a sky the color of slate and a stillness in the air that felt wrong. She had learned to read Vermont weather over the past months to sense the changes in pressure and temperature that preceded storms. But this was different. This was something she had never felt before. She climbed the stairs to the rim of the quarry and looked out at the valley. The clouds hung low and heavy, pressing down on the hills like a weight. The trees were motionless, not a single branch stirring, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Old Salvatore was standing at the edge of the quarry, his gray hair pressed flat by a hat he never wore, his weathered face turned toward the sky. "It's coming," he said. He did not turn to look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the clouds, on the heaviness gathering in the air. The storm, the big one, the kind that comes once in a generation. "How bad, bad?" He finally turned and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Fear. "I came to Vermont in 1824. I have seen 50 winters. I have never seen a sky like this." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Get inside. Stay inside and pray." He left before she could respond, moving with a speed that belied his 72 years, heading back toward the village at as fast as his old legs could carry him. Lenora spent the day preparing. She brought extra firewood down to the shelter. She filled every container she had with water from the spring that bubbled up at the quarry's edge. She checked the goats, made sure they had feed and water, reinforced the door of their shelter with extra planks. She did everything she could think of to ready herself for whatever was coming. The snow started at sunset. It came down thick in fast flakes the size of coins, falling so densely that she could barely see the opposite wall of the quarry. Within an hour, the rim had disappeared behind a curtain of white. Within 2 hours, she could not see the stairs. The wind came next. It howled through the valley like something alive, screaming over the hills and through the trees, with a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But here at the bottom of the quarry, the wind was just a distant roar. The granite walls blocked it completely, turning the pit into an island of calm in a sea of chaos. Lenora sat by her fire and listened to the storm raging 30 feet above her head, and she understood for the first time what Salvatore had meant about the quarry being a room with no roof. The roof was the storm, the walls were the granite, and she was inside, warm and safe, while the world outside was being buried alive. The blizzard did not stop for 5 days. On the morning of the third day, the first refugees arrived. Lenora was digging out the entrance to the quarry, clearing the snow that had accumulated overnight from the platform at the top when she heard voices. She looked up and saw figures emerging from the white wilderness, stumbling through drifts that were chest-high, in places barely visible against the endless white of the storm. The Brennan family, father and mother, and 4 children ranging in age from 3 to 12. Their cabin had collapsed in the night, the roof giving way under the weight of snow that had accumulated faster than anyone could shovel. They had spent hours digging out, more hours struggling through the drifts, and they had come to the quarry because they had heard the stories, and they had nowhere else to go. Lenora led them down the stairs and into the shelter, and she watched their faces change as they descended. The fear and exhaustion and cold that had marked their expressions gave way to wonder, to disbelief, to something that looked almost like joy. It was warm at the bottom of the quarry, 50 degrees while the world above was 30 below. The fire she had burning raised it to 65. The children who had been blue with cold were running and playing. Within an hour, their laughter echoing off the granite walls like a promise that survival was possible. More refugees came that day. A widow named Kowalski dragging her 2 small boys through snow that threatened to swallow them whole. The Morgan family, 6 people in all, their farmhouse, buried to the eaves. The Petersons, the O'Connors, a dozen others whose homes had been destroyed or rendered uninhabitable by the storm. They descended the wooden stairs into the quarry, expecting to find desperation and suffering. Instead, they found warmth. They found shelter. They found a woman who had built a refuge in the most unlikely place imaginable. Lenora took them all in. She opened her shelter, her storage building, even her goat pen. Anywhere that people could find space to sit, to sleep, to survive. She rationed her food, her firewood, her water from the spring that never froze because it came from deep in the earth where temperature stayed constant. She organized the refugees into work crews with an efficiency that surprised everyone, including herself. Some were assigned to dig the entrance tunnel each morning, keeping the path clear so more survivors could descend. Some tended the fire, keeping it burning steady, managing the heat so the shelter stayed warm without wasting wood. Some cared for the children, the 11 children under 10 who needed watching while their parents worked. Some prepared food, stretching Lenora's stores with whatever the refugees had brought, turning scraps into meals that kept everyone alive. The quarry became a small village, a community carved from desperation. People who had barely known each other above ground became neighbors in the stone-walled refuge below. They shared blankets and food and stories, huddling together against a disaster that would have killed them all if they had faced it alone. They argued sometimes. 37 people in a space meant for one will always argue. But they survived. And survival created bonds that would last long after the snow melted. By the 4th day, there were 37 people living at the bottom of Lenora's quarry, and on the morning of the 4th day, the 38th arrived. Horace Pembroke came to the quarry as a last resort. He came alone, his silver hair disheveled, his ruby stick pin lost somewhere in the snow. His fine house on the hill had been one of the first to lose its roof to the weight of the accumulating snow, the timbers that he had thought so sturdy giving way with a crack that had echoed across the valley like a gunshot. He had spent 3 days wandering from shelter to shelter, turned away by people who remembered how he had treated them when he held the power. The families whose farms he had bought for pennies when they fell behind on loans. The workers he had cheated out of wages. The widows whose properties he had swindled, just as he had tried to swindle Lenora. They all remembered, and their doors remained closed to him. So he came to the quarry, the worthless pit, the flooded hole that produced nothing but mosquitoes. He came to the woman he had tried to cheat, the woman he had called foolish, the woman whose husband he had called a fool. He came because he had nowhere else to go. Lenora met him at the top of the stairs. She was standing on the platform. She had built the platform that blocked the worst of the wind and snow, looking down at the man who had caused her so much pain. He stood below her knee-deep in a drift, his fine coat ruined, his pale eyes red from the cold, his face bearing the marks of 3 days without shelter. Mrs. Whitmore. His voice was broken, stripped of its usual confidence and condescension. I know I have no right to ask. I know what I said about this place about your husband, but I have nowhere else to go. Lenora looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the day he had come to her door with his $12 and his contempt. She thought about Salvatore's words about how Pembroke had sold them the quarry, knowing it would fail, knowing he could buy it back for nothing when their dreams collapsed. She thought about Tobias, who had believed so completely in this place, who had died trying to make his vision real. She could turn him away. Everyone would understand. Everyone would probably applaud. Horace Pembroke had spent his life taking from others, and now others had the chance to let him face the consequences. But she would not Horace Pembroke. She looked at his frost-bitten fingers, his blue-tinged lips, his eyes that were finally showing something other than calculation. She saw a man who was going to die as she turned him away, and she could not have that death on her conscience. Come down, she said. There's room. Pembroke stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded a small, broken movement, and he climbed the drifted path to the platform. He descended the wooden stairs into the quarry, into the warmth and the light in the community of people he had spent his life exploiting. No one greeted him, no one offered him a hand or a word of welcome, but no one tried to throw him out either. They made room for him grudgingly, and he found a corner of the shelter where he could sit and warm himself by the fire. He stayed for the remaining 2 days of the storm. He ate Lenora's food. He warmed himself by Lenora's fire. He survived because of the shelter he had called a worthless pit, because of the woman he had called a fool. And he learned something about worth that had nothing to do with dollars. The storm broke on February 8th. The sun emerged for the first time in 5 days, revealing a valley transformed into a white wilderness. Houses were buried to their chimneys. Roads had disappeared entirely. The church was a ruin, its roof collapsed under the weight of snow. The general store had caved in. Nearly a third of the buildings in the village had suffered some kind of damage. Trees that had stood for 100 years lay snapped like twigs. Fences that had marked property lines for generations had vanished beneath drifts that wouldn't fully melt until May. The world above the quarry was a landscape of devastation, a testament to the power of nature to destroy everything that humans built. But the quarry was untouched. The granite walls had stood against the wind like they had stood for 1,000,000 years, indifferent to weather that had destroyed everything built by human hands. The shelter at the bottom was warm and dry, its sod roof holding firm, its chimney still drawing perfectly. The 37 people who had taken refuge there were alive, every one of them, because a widow had looked at a flooded hole and seen something no one else could see. They emerged from the quarry, slowly blinking in the sunlight, unable to fully comprehend the destruction that surrounded them. Some wept when they saw their homes, or what remained of their homes. Some stood in silence, processing the reality that everything they had built was gone. But all of them were alive, and all of them knew who had saved them. The morning after she refused Horace Pembroke's $12, Lenora woke before dawn. She lay in the narrow bed of the cabin, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling that Tobias had built with his own hands, listening to the silence that filled the space where his breathing should have been. The cabin felt too large now, too empty, too full of absence. Every corner held a memory. Every shadow reminded her of what she had lost. She rose and dressed in the darkness, pulling on the heavy wool dress that had been her mother's, lacing her boots with fingers that trembled from cold and something else. Fear, perhaps, or determination. She could no longer tell the difference. The walk to the quarry took 20 minutes in the gray light of pre-dawn. Frost crunched beneath her boots, and her breath made clouds that hung in the still air like ghosts. The trees were black silhouettes against a sky that was slowly lightening from charcoal to pewter, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, its harsh voice echoing across the silent valley. She reached the quarry as the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern rim. The water lay still and dark below a mirror reflecting the brightening sky. 12 feet deep, Tobias had estimated. 12 feet of accumulated rainfall and snowmelt and groundwater seepage filling the pit that men had carved from the hillside over 15 years of labor. The granite walls rose sheer and gray on all sides, 30 feet of solid stone that had witnessed the cutting of countless blocks, the labor of countless workers, the dreams of countless men who had seen fortune in the Vermont granite. Now it witnessed only her. Lenora walked slowly around the rim, studying the walls the way she had learned to study them over the past weeks. The eastern side drew her attention as it always did. The seam in the rock where two formations met the slight irregularity in the otherwise perfect geometry of the quarry. The water was lower here, 6 inches below the level on the western side, and that difference told her everything she needed to know. The water was draining, slowly, imperceptibly, but draining nonetheless. She found a long branch and used it to probe the seam filling for the crack that must be there. The branch scraped against granite, found nothing, scraped again. Then it slipped into something. A gap. A fissure in the stone where the water was seeping through to whatever lay below. Her heart began to beat faster. She withdrew the branch and examined the wet end. It had gone in perhaps 6 inches before hitting resistance. 6 inches of crack. 6 inches of passage through which the quarry was slowly emptying itself. Not enough to drain it in any reasonable time, but enough to show her what was possible. If she could widen that crack, she could speed the drainage. If she could speed the drainage, she could expose the floor. If she could expose the floor, she could build. The logic was simple. The execution would be anything but. The farmer's name was Hoskins, and he lived 3 miles down the valley road in a farmhouse that had seen better decades. He was a widower himself, his wife dead these 7 years, his children grown and scattered to cities, where there was work that didn't break your back and freeze your bones. He survived on stubbornness and routine, and he had known Tobias Whitmore as a man who worked hard and paid his debts. Lenora found him in his barn mending a harness by the light of a single lantern. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, his weathered face showing neither surprise nor welcome. Farmers in Vermont did not waste energy on expressions that served no purpose. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. His voice was flat neutral, giving nothing away. "Heard about your husband. Sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Mr. Hoskins. I've come to ask a favor." He set down the harness and studied her with eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. "What kind of favor?" "I need to borrow a pickaxe and a shovel and whatever other tools you might spare for working stone." His eyebrows rose slightly. It was the most emotion she had seen from him. "Working stone? What stone would that be?" "The quarry. I'm going to drain it." For a long moment, Hoskins simply stared at her. Then he did something she did not expect. He laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, more bark than humor, but it was genuine. "Drain the quarry," he repeated. "That pit's been filling with water for 10 years. What makes you think you can drain it?" "The water level is lower on the eastern side. There's a crack in the stone. The quarry is already draining itself. I just need to help it along." Hoskins considered this. His eyes moved to the window toward the distant hillside where the quarry lay hidden among the pines. He had worked in that quarry himself years ago, cutting granite alongside the Italian crews who had carved it from the hillside. He knew the stone knew its secrets, knew what lay beneath the dark water. "Pembroke was here yesterday," he said finally, "asking about you, wanting to know if you'd taken his offer yet." "I refused his offer." "I heard. $12 for a flooded pit." He shook his head slowly. "Pembroke's a snake, but he's not stupid. If he's offering anything at all for that quarry, it's because he knows something about it that you don't. Or because he's afraid I'll figure out what he already knows." Hoskins looked at her with new interest. "You think Pembroke wants that land for more than just speculation?" I think my husband saw something in that quarry that Pembroke doesn't want anyone else to see. And I think Pembroke sold it to him, knowing it would fail, knowing he could buy it back for nothing when Tobias gave up. She paused, feeling the anger rise in her chest. Tobias didn't give up, and neither will I. The farmer was quiet for a long time. He picked up the harness again, turned it over in his hands, set it down. His fingers drummed against his thigh, a nervous habit that betrayed thoughts he would not voice. "The tools are in the shed," he said at last. "Take what you need. Bring them back when you're done." He did not wish her luck. He did not offer to help. But he did not try to talk her out of it either, and for that, Lenora was grateful. The first week was the hardest. Lenora descended into the quarry each morning at dawn, climbing down a rope ladder she had rigged to the eastern wall. The water came up to her waist as she waded to the seam in the rock, the cold so intense that her legs went numb within minutes. She worked until she could no longer feel her hands, then climbed out to warm herself by a small fire she kept burning at the rim. Then she went back down and worked some more. The pickaxe was heavier than anything she had ever lifted. Each swing sent shock waves through her arms and shoulders with jolts of impact that left her muscles screaming. The granite was unyielding, resisting every blow with the indifference of stone that had formed millions of years before humans existed and would endure millions of years after they were gone. But stone could be broken. Men had been breaking stone since before history began. They had carved civilizations from rock-built pyramids and temples and monuments that still stood after thousands of years. They had learned the secrets of granite, learned where it was strong, and where it was weak learned how to make it yield to human will. Lenora did not have thousands of years. She had weeks, maybe months before winter made the work impossible. She had limited strength, limited tools, limited knowledge of the craft that men spent lifetimes mastering. But she had something else. She had desperation. And desperation, she was learning, could accomplish things that skill and strength could not. By the end of the first week, she had widened the crack by 3 inches. 3 inches, 72 hours of labor, hundreds of swings of the pickaxe blisters that had become calluses, that had become raw wounds, that had become calluses again. 3 inches of progress against a wall of granite that stretched 30 feet above her head and extended deep into the hillside beyond. It was not enough. It would never be enough at this rate. But it was something. It was progress. It was proof that the stone could be broken, that the crack could be widened, that her vision of a drain quarry was not merely fantasy. She climbed out of the pit as the sun set on the 7th day, her body aching in places she hadn't known could ache, her hands wrapped in bloody rags, her clothes soaked and stiff with quarry water. She sat on a boulder at the rim and looked down at the dark surface below, at the slight depression on the eastern side where the water level was fractionally lower than everywhere else. 3 inches. She would need to widen it by feet, not inches. She would need to turn that seep into a stream, that stream into a river, that river into a torrent that would empty the quarry in weeks instead of decades. She did not know how she would do it. She did not know if it was even possible, but she knew she would not stop trying. Old Salvatore found her on the morning of the 9th day. She was at the bottom of the quarry, waist deep in water, swinging the pickaxe at the crack she had been widening for over a week. Her form was terrible, her technique non-existent, her understanding of stone limited to what she had observed and guessed. But she was making progress inch by painful inch, and she was too focused on the work to notice the figure that had appeared at the rim above. "You are doing it wrong." The voice echoed off the granite walls, filling the quarry with its resonance. Lenora looked up, squinting against the morning sun, and saw a silhouette standing at the eastern edge. An old man stooped with age, his face invisible against the bright sky. "Who's there?" "Someone who knows stone better than you do." The figure shifted, and she could see him more clearly now. Old Salvatore, the Italian stonecutter who had worked the quarries for 30 years. "You swing like you are chopping wood. Granite is not wood. Granite must be persuaded, not attacked." Lenora lowered the pickaxe, suddenly aware of how foolish she must look. a woman standing in freezing water beating at solid rock with all the skill of a child throwing a tantrum. I'm doing the best I can. Your best will get you nothing but broken hands and a broken spirit. Come up. I will show you. She climbed the rope ladders, her arms trembling with exhaustion, her legs numb from the cold water. Salvatore was waiting at the rim, his sharp eyes taking in her bloody hands, her soaked clothes, the determination that burned in her face despite the obvious futility of what she was attempting. You have been at this for more than a week, he said. It was not a question. 9 days. And how much have you widened the crack? 3 inches, maybe 4. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. 3 inches in 9 days. At that rate, you will drain the quarry in approximately never. I know. She felt the frustration rising in her throat, the despair that she had been holding at bay through sheer force of will. But I don't know what else to. I don't know how to work stone. I don't have crews of men or proper equipment or years of experience. I just have a pickaxe and a crack and the knowledge that the quarry can be drained if I can make that crack big enough. Salvatore studied her for a long moment. Then he walked to the edge of the quarry and looked down at the dark water at the seam in the eastern wall where she had been working. The crack is in the right place, he said finally. The seam between the formations is a natural weakness. The water has been finding its way through for years, wearing at the stone, widening the passage. You are trying to do what nature does slowly, but you are fighting the stone instead of working with it. How do I work with it? He turned to face her, and for the first time she saw something like approval in his eyes. You learn to read the grain. Every piece of granite has a direction, a way it wants to split. Fight against the grain and you will break your tools and your body before you break the stone. Work with the grain and the stone will open for you like a door. He picked up the pickaxe she had left at the rim, hefting it in his gnarled hands. His fingers were twisted with age and arthritis, his grip not what it had once been. But the way he held the tool spoke of decades of practice, of a relationship with the weight and balance that went beyond mere skill. Watch, he said. He did not descend into the quarry. His body would not allow it. But he demonstrated the swing, the angle, the way the weight of the pickaxe should do most of the work. He showed her how to look at the stone, to see the faint lines that indicated the grain, to find the places where a well-aimed blow would accomplish more than a dozen misdirected ones. The crack you are widening runs along the grain, he said. That is good, but you are hitting it straight on, trying to break through by force. Instead, you should hit at an angle following the grain, letting the natural weakness of the stone do the work for you. He handed her the pickaxe and she felt the difference immediately. Not in the tool, which was the same pickaxe she had been using for 9 days. In herself, in the way she understood what she was trying to do. Tomorrow, Salvatore said, I will come back, I will sit here and watch, and I will tell you when you are doing it wrong, which will be often, but you will learn. And when you learn, you will drain this quarry faster than you believe possible. Why are you helping me? The old man looked at her and something shifted in his face. Something that might have been memory, or regret, or hope. Because I had a daughter once, he said. She would have been your age now if she had lived. And she had the same fire in her eyes that I see in yours. The same refusal to accept what everyone else accepted. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I could not save her, but perhaps I can help you save yourself. He turned and walked away before she could respond, his stooped figure disappearing into the trees that surrounded the quarry. Lenora stood at the rim holding the pickaxe, looking down at the dark water that still filled the pit. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow I will learn. The lessons continued for weeks. Every morning, Salvatore appeared at the rim of the quarry as the sun rose. He could not descend into the pit, could not demonstrate the techniques he was teaching, could not take the pickaxe from her hands and show her exactly how to swing. But his voice carried clearly from above, and his eyes missed nothing. Too high, you are wasting energy on the backswing. There, you see how the stone flaked away. That is the grain opening for you. No, 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 you are fighting it again. Feel the stone. Let it tell you where it wants to break. Lenore learned to listen not just to Salvatore's instructions, but to the stone itself. The sound it made when struck, the way it vibrated under the impact, the subtle differences between a blow that was working with the grain and one that was working against it. She learned to read the faint lines in the granite, to see the patterns that indicated weakness, to find the places where her strength could be multiplied by the stone's own structure. By the end of the second week, she was widening the crack by an inch a day instead of an inch every 3 days. By the end of the third week, the trickle of water seeping through the crack had become a visible stream. By the end of the fourth week, the stream had become a rush water pouring through the widened channel into whatever cavern or aquifer lay below the quarry floor. The water level began to drop visibly an inch a day, then 2 inches, then 3. The dark surface that had seemed eternal was receding, revealing more and more of the granite walls with each passing day. Salvatore watched the progress with an expression that might have been pride. "You are doing well," he said one morning as Lenora climbed out of the pit to warm herself by the fire. The water level had dropped 4 feet in the past week, and she no longer needed to wade to reach the crack. "Better than I expected, better than most men would do. I had a good teacher. You had a stubborn student. That matters more than the teacher." He paused, his eyes moving to the quarry, to the walls that were emerging from the water, like something being born. Another 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then the floor will be exposed. Then the real work begins. Building the shelter. Building everything. The shelter is just the beginning. You will need stairs to get down, a platform at the top to protect the entrance, storage for food and firewood, a place for animals, if you want to survive the winter without starving. A quarry is just a hole in the ground until someone makes it into a home. Lenore looked at the pit that had consumed her life for the past month. The walls were beautiful in the morning light, gray granite streaked with veins of white and black, smooth where the blocks had been cut rough, where the stone had simply broken away. 30 feet of solid rock forming a space that was larger than any building she had ever lived in. A room with no roof, Salvatore had called it. A room heated by the earth itself, protected from wind and weather, by walls that had stood for millions of years. "Tell me about the temperature," she said. "You said it stays at 50 degrees. How is that possible?" Salvatore smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something almost young. "Granite is a miracle of nature. It absorbs heat, slowly releases heat, slowly. In summer, the sun warms the surface, and that warmth seeps into the stone over months. In winter, the stone releases that warmth back into the air. The deeper you go, the more stable the temperature becomes. At the bottom of that quarry, 30 feet below the surface, the temperature will be the same in January as it is in July. 50 degrees, give or take. Not warm, but not cold. Comfortable. Survivable. In the chimney, you said the quarry would create a natural draft. Hot air rises. At the bottom of the quarry, any fire you light will warm the air around it. That warm air will rise along the granite walls, which are cooler than the air. As it rises, it pulls more air from below to replace it. Build your chimney right, and it will draw perfectly, pulling smoke up and out while fresh air flows down to feed the fire. The quarry becomes a natural bellows, breathing in and out with every change in temperature. Lenore absorbed this, filing it away with everything else she had learned. The quarry was not just a hole in the ground. It was a system, a machine built by nature and refined by the men who had carved it. Every aspect of its design, intentional or accidental, contributed to an environment that could sustain life even in the harshest conditions. "Pembroke has no idea," she said softly. "He thinks this place is worthless." Pembroke sees only the surface. He sees water and stone, and a property he can buy for nothing and sell for something. He does not see what lies beneath. He does not understand what you are building here. "What am I building?" Salvatore looked at her, and his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "A future child. You are building a future. The quarry floor emerged from the water on the 23rd day of October. Lenora descended the rope ladder that morning and found herself standing on solid granite for the first time. The stone was wet and cold, covered with a thin layer of silt that had accumulated over the decade the quarry had been flooded. But beneath the silt, the floor was exactly as Salvatore had described, flat as a table, smooth as a floor, stretching 40 feet wide and 60 feet long. She walked slowly across the exposed granite, her boots leaving prints in the silt. The walls rose around her, like the sides of a cathedral, gray and solemn and ancient. The sky was a rectangle of blue, far above, framed by the edges of the pit, impossibly distant from where she stood. And it was warm. Not warm exactly, but not cold. The air at the bottom of the quarry was still and mild, untouched by the October chill that was turning breath to fog on the surface. 50 degrees, just as Salvatore had promised. A temperature that felt like nothing at all after weeks of working in freezing water. Lenora stood in the center of the quarry floor and turned in a slow circle, taking in everything. The smooth walls, the level floor, the natural shelter created by 30 feet of granite on every side. The stillness that seemed to emanate from the stone itself, a silence so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat. This was what Tobias had seen. This was what he had died trying to reach. She reached up and touched the ring that hung on a cord around her neck, feeling its warmth against her chest. She thought about her husband, about his dreams, about the vision he had carried with him from Massachusetts to Vermont, from the coastal town where they had met, to this remote valley where he had thought they would build their future. He had been right. The quarry was not worthless. The quarry was a treasure hidden beneath 12 feet of water, waiting for someone with the vision to see it and the determination to reach it. That someone would have been Tobias. Now it would be her. I found it, she whispered to no one. To Tobias, perhaps, to herself, to the stone that surrounded her. I found what you were looking for. The granite walls absorbed her words and gave nothing back. The construction began the next day. Lenora had spent weeks planning while she worked on the drainage, sketching designs in the dirt, discussing ideas with Salvatore, thinking through every aspect of what she would need to survive a Vermont winter at the bottom of a stone pit. Now she put those plans into action. The trees came first. She felled pines from the hillside above the quarry, choosing straight trunks of uniform size, cutting them with a sweep borrowed from Hoskins, and hauling them to the rim with ropes and determination. Each tree was a battle, each log a triumph. Her arms grew stronger with the work, her hands grew harder, her body adapted to demands it had never faced before. The logs had to be lowered into the quarry, a process that took hours for each one. She rigged a system of ropes and pulleys, improvised from materials she scrounged from abandoned farms and sympathetic neighbors. The pulleys squealed with every use, the ropes frayed and had to be replaced. The logs swung wildly and threatened to crush her against the granite walls. But day by day, the pile of lumber at the bottom of the quarry grew. Salvatore watched from the rim, calling down advice and encouragement. He could not help with the physical labor, could not descend into the pit to lend his strength to the lifting and hauling. But his knowledge was invaluable, his experience a guide that kept her from making mistakes that would have cost her weeks of wasted effort. The north wall, he said, when she asked where to build a shelter. The sun strikes the south wall in the afternoon, warming the stone. Build against the north wall, and you will have that warmth at your backs. The granite will radiate heat into your shelter all through the night. How thick should the walls be? 8 feet high at minimum. You want the roof above the level of any water that might seep in during spring melt. And you want space to move, to store, to live. This is not a coffin, it is a home. She built the walls from logs, notching them at the corners, so they locked together in a pattern that Salvatore called saddle notching. The technique was old, he told her, brought to America by the Scandinavians who had settled the northern forests. Simple and strong, requiring no nails, no mortar, no materials beyond the wood itself. The gaps between the logs she filled with moss and clay, a mixture she prepared in batches and applied with her hands. The work was tedious and messy, but essential. Every gap was a potential draft, a pathway for cold air to seep into the shelter and steal the warmth she would need to survive. The roof came next, pitched to shed rain and snow planks covered with tar paper she had bartered for with the last of her savings. Over the tar paper went sod-heavy chunks of earth and grass that she cut from the meadow above the quarry and lowered down by the bucketful. The sod would insulate the roof, hold the planks in place, help the structure blend into the granite surroundings until it looked like something that had grown from the stone rather than been built upon it. The chimney was the most difficult part and the most critical. Salvatore had explained the principle, but executing it required skills she did not possess. She gathered flat stones from the quarry floor remnants of blocks that had cracked during cutting, irregular pieces that the original workers had discarded. She fitted them together like a puzzle, building up the chimney stone by stone, creating a flue that rose from the hearth to the rim of the quarry. The first attempt failed. The stone shifted, the flue collapsed, hours of work reduced to rubble in seconds. The second attempt failed as well. The draw was wrong, the smoke backing into the shelter, filling the space with choking clouds that drove her out, gasping. The third attempt, guided by increasingly specific instructions from Salvatore, finally succeeded. The chimney drew perfectly, pulling smoke up and out, creating the natural draft that the quarry's shape encouraged. She lit a fire in the hearth and watched the smoke rise straight and true, disappearing into the October sky far above. The shelter was complete. The first night Lenora slept at the bottom of the quarry, she dreamed of Tobias. He was standing at the edge of the pit, looking down at her with the smile she remembered so well. His hair was wet with mist, his boots muddy, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He looked exactly as he had looked on the last morning. She saw him alive. "You did it," he said. His voice echoed off the granite walls, filling the quarry with warmth. "You saw what I saw." She tried to speak, tried to tell him everything she had done, everything she had learned, everything she had sacrificed to reach this moment, but no words came. She could only look at him, at the face she had loved, at the man she had lost. "Don't stop," he said. "There's more to build, more to do. Don't stop." She woke to the gray light of dawn filtering down through the quarry, opening to the crackling of the fire she had banked the night before, to the realization that she was alone in a shelter she had built at the bottom of a hole in the ground, and that she had never felt more alive. The secondary structures came next. Against the south wall, Lenora built a smaller shelter for storage. The temperature in the quarry was constant, cool enough to preserve food, warm enough to prevent freezing. She filled the storage shelter with supplies she had gathered over the weeks of construction, sacks of flour and corn barrels, of salted pork jars, of preserved vegetables she had bought or bartered from farms throughout the valley. Against the east wall, she built a pen for the goats. Two of them purchased from a farmer named Hendricks, who was leaving for Ohio and needed cash more than livestock. The goats were hardy animals, accustomed to Vermont winters, capable of producing milk even in the coldest months. They would provide sustenance and companionship through the long isolation ahead. The wooden stairs took a full week to construct. She built them in zigzag sections, following the natural contours of the quarry walls, creating a path that descended from rim to floor in a series of switchbacks. Each section was bolted to the granite using iron pins she had forged with the help of the village blacksmith, a taciturn man who asked no questions and charged fair prices. The platform at the top was the final piece, a small wooden structure built at the head of the stairs, with a roof to keep rain and snow from falling directly into the quarry. The platform created an airlock of sorts, a transitional space between the world above and the world below. By the time the first snow fell in early November, Lenora had created something unprecedented, a homestead at the bottom of a quarry, 30 feet below the surface, surrounded by granite walls that blocked every wind, held every temperature, turned an abandoned pit into a sanctuary. She stood on the platform and looked down at what she had built. The shelter against the north wall, smoke rising from its chimney. The storage building against the south wall, its door firmly latched. The goat pen against the east wall, the animals visible as white shapes against the gray stone. The stairs descending in their careful zigzag, connecting her underground world to the one above. It was not beautiful, not by any conventional measure. The structures were rough built by hands that had learned their craft through trial and error rather than apprenticeship. The proportions were not quite right, the lines not quite straight, the surfaces not quite smooth, but it was hers. Every log, every stone, every plank had passed through her hands. Every nail had been driven by her hammer. Every decision had been made by her mind. She had built a home in a place where everyone said nothing could survive. The visitors came slowly at first, then in a steady trickle. Word had spread through the valley about the widow in the quarry, and curiosity eventually overcame skepticism. Farmers and their weeds, shopkeepers and laborers, even the children from the village school, they came to see what Lenora Whitmore had built at the bottom of the flooded pit that everyone had dismissed as worthless. They descended the wooden stairs with expressions of doubt, expecting to find squalor and desperation. Instead, they found warmth. The temperature at the bottom of the quarry was 50 degrees, climbing to 65 with the fire burning, while the world above shivered through the first cold snaps of winter. They found comfort. The shelter was snug and tight, the chimney drawing perfectly, the sleeping loft warm with heat that rose from the fire below. The storage building was stocked with supplies that would last through spring. The goats were healthy in their stone-walled pen. They found a woman who was not simply surviving but thriving. Ruth Brennan was among the first to visit. She was a widow herself, 35 years old, with two young sons, in a farm that was slowly failing under the weight of debts her dead husband had accumulated. She descended the stairs with her boys clinging to her skirts, and she stood in the center of the quarry floor with tears streaming down her face. "How did you do this?" she whispered. "How did you build all this by yourself?" "I had help," Lenora said. "Old Salvatore taught me about the stone. Hoskins lent me tools. The blacksmith made the iron pins for the stairs. It wasn't just me." "But you did the work. You had the vision. You refused to give up when everyone else said you should." Lenora thought about the weeks of labor, the bleeding hands, the aching muscles, the days when she had wanted nothing more than to climb out of the pit and never return. She thought about Tobias, about his dream, about the future he had seen in this place. She thought about Horace Pembroke and his $12, and his certainty that she would fail. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "This was all I had." Ruth looked around the quarry at the shelter and the storage building, and the goat pen at the walls that rose 30 feet to the rectangle of gray sky above. Her expression was thoughtful, calculating. "If anything happens," she said quietly, "so her boys would not hear, if the winter gets bad and we have nowhere else to go, can we come here?" Lenora thought about the space, about the supplies, about the capacity of the quarry to shelter more than one person. She thought about the isolation of the winter months, the loneliness that would come with being the only living soul at the bottom of a stone pit. "Yes," she said, "if anything happens, come here. There's room." Horace Pembroke heard the stories and seethed. He had expected the widow to fail. He had counted on it. The quarry was supposed to be her undoing, the final blow that would drive her back to Massachusetts with nothing leaving the property to be scooped up for pennies at the tax auction. He had played this game before with other desperate people, and he had always won. But Lenora Whitmore was not playing by his rules. She had drained the quarry. She had built a shelter. She was surviving, thriving, even in a place that should have been her grave. Word was spreading through the valley about the widow in the pit, and the word was not what Pembroke wanted to hear. People were impressed. People were admiring. People were starting to think that maybe the quarry was not so worthless after all. He could not allow that. He began his campaign in the general store, where farmers gathered on cold mornings to trade gossip along with goods. He spoke casually, planting seeds of doubt, with the skill of a man who had spent decades manipulating public opinion. "She's living in a hole like an animal," he said to anyone who would listen. "No proper woman would do such a thing. She must have gone mad with grief. It's sad, really. Tragic." Some people nodded along. Others looked uncomfortable, remembering their own visits to the quarry, the warmth they had felt, the shelter they had seen. But none of them contradicted him openly. Pembroke was too powerful, too connected, too dangerous to cross. He escalated his attacks as winter deepened. He questioned Lenora's morality, suggesting that no decent woman would live alone in a pit where men could visit without supervision. He questioned her sanity, pointing to the obsessive labor she had undertaken as proof of a mind unhinged by loss. He questioned the safety of the quarry itself, predicting floods when the spring melt came, predicting collapse, predicting disaster. "I give her until February," he said, and the words became a refrain repeated in kitchens and barns throughout the valley. "March at the latest. She'll flood when the snow melts if she doesn't freeze first. Mark my words." But December came and Lenora did not freeze. Her fire burned steady, fed by firewood she had gathered and stored. Her chimney drew perfectly, sending smoke up through the still air of the quarry and into the winter sky above. Her shelter stayed warm and dry, while the cabins above shivered through the coldest nights. January came, and the quarry did not flood. The drainage channel she had cut continued to function, carrying away any water that seeped in through the granite walls. The floor remained dry, the shelters remained intact, the goats remained healthy in their pen. The temperature at the bottom held steady at 50 degrees, rising to 65 with the fire burning. Above, the thermometer dropped to 20 below and stayed there for days at a time. Farmers ran out of firewood. Cattle froze in their barns. The village doctor treated frostbite and hypothermia and the pneumonia that came from sleeping in houses that could not be adequately heated. But at the bottom of the quarry, Lenora Whitmore was warm. The contrast was not lost on the valley. The blizzard began on the 3rd of February. Lenora woke that morning to a silence that felt wrong. She climbed the stairs to the platform and looked out at a world transformed. The sky was the color of iron, heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the hills. The air was still completely still, without even the faint breeze that usually whispered through the pines. She had never seen anything like it. Old Salvatore arrived an hour later, moving faster than she had ever seen him move. His face was drawn, his eyes wide, with something she had never seen in them before. Fear. "It's coming," he said without preamble. "The storm, the big one, the kind that kills." "How bad?" "I came to Vermont in 1824. 50 winters. I have seen blizzards that buried houses, that killed cattle by the hundreds, that closed the valley for weeks. I have never seen a sky like this." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice trembled. "Get inside. Stay inside and pray." He turned to leave, and Lenora caught his arm. "Come down," she said. "Stay with me. The quarry is safe. You know that." But Salvatore shook his head. "I have my shack. I have survived winters before. I will survive this one." He looked at her, and his eyes softened. "You have done well, child. Whatever happens, remember that. You have done well." He walked away through the pines, his stooped figure disappearing into the gray morning. Lenora spent the day preparing. She brought extra firewood down to the shelter, enough to last weeks if necessary. She filled every container she had with water from the spring that bubbled up at the quarry's edge. She checked the goats, reinforced their pen, made sure they had food and water for days. The snow started at sunset. It came down thick in fast flakes the size of coins that fell so densely she could barely see the opposite wall of the quarry. Within an hour, the rim had vanished behind a curtain of white. Within 2 hours, the platform was buried. The wind came with the darkness. It howled over the valley like something alive, screaming through the hills with a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But at the bottom of the quarry, the wind was just a distant roar. The granite walls blocked it completely, turning the pit into an island of calm in a sea of destruction. Lenora sat by her fire and listened to the storm raging 30 feet above her head. She thought about Salvatore in his shack at the edge of the village. She thought about Ruth Brennan and her 2 boys on their failing farm. She thought about all the people in the valley who were facing the storm in houses that shook with every gust and cabins that leaked heat through every crack in shelters that suddenly seemed very fragile against the fury of nature. She thought about Horace Pembroke in his fine house on the hill, the house with the roof. He was so proud of the house that was supposed to prove his superiority over all the people he had cheated and manipulated over the years. And she thought about the quarry, the worthless pit, the flooded hole that produced nothing but mosquitoes, the quarry that was warm and dry and safe while the world above was being buried alive. The storm did not stop for 5 days. The first refugees arrived on the morning of the third day. Lenora had spent the previous 2 days in a rhythm of survival. Wake before dawn, climb the stairs to the platform, dig out the entrance that the wind had buried overnight. Check the sky for any sign of the storm breaking. See nothing but white. Descend back into the warmth of the quarry. Tend the fire. Feed the goats. Wait. The digging was the hardest part. The snow accumulated faster than seemed possible, filling the stairway entrance with drifts that reached higher each morning. She worked with a shovel she had brought down from the cabin weeks ago, carving a tunnel through the white mass, knowing that if she stopped, if she let the snow seal the entrance completely, she would be trapped at the bottom of the pit until spring. On the third morning, she was halfway through the tunnel when she heard voices. They were faint at first, nearly lost in the howling of the wind. She stopped digging and listened to her breath making clouds in the cold air of the tunnel. The voices came again closer now, and she could hear the desperation in them. People calling out, people searching, people in trouble. She dug faster, her arms burning with the effort, her shovel biting into the packed snow. The tunnel widened, lengthened, and suddenly she broke through to the surface and found herself looking at a group of figures huddled in the storm. The Brennan family. Ruth was in front, her face raw from the wind, her arms wrapped around her 2 boys. Behind her came her husband's brother, a man named Patrick, who had been staying with them since the harvest. They were covered in snow, their clothes soaked through their eyes, wild with fear and exhaustion. The cabin, Ruth gasped. The roof collapsed. In the night, we barely got out. Lenora did not hesitate. She reached out and pulled the nearest boy into the tunnel, then the other, then Ruth herself. Patrick came last, his larger frame barely fitting through the passage she had carved. Down the stairs, she said, all the way to the bottom. There's a fire, there's warmth. Go. They went stumbling down the wooden steps, their frozen limbs barely cooperating. Lenora followed, pulling the tunnel closed behind her as best she could, trying to keep the wind and snow from following them into the quarry. At the bottom, the Brennan stood in the center of the floor, looking around with expressions of disbelief. The shelter glowed with firelight. The air was warm, impossibly warm compared to the frozen hell they had just escaped. The granite walls rose around them like the walls of a fortress, blocking the wind, holding the cold at bay. Ruth began to cry. It's warm, she said, the words coming out in a sob. Oh God, it's warm. Her boys, 5 and 7 years old, were already shedding their frozen coats, their small bodies gravitating toward the fire like moths to flame. Patrick stood apart, his jaw tight, his eyes taking in everything. He was a proud man, Lenora knew, a man who did not like accepting charity. But even pride had its limits when your family was freezing to death. There's food in the storage shelter, Lenora said. Blankets in the chest by the bed. Get warm first. We'll figure out the rest later. She left them by the fire and climbed back up to the platform. The tunnel she had dug was already filling with snow, the wind erasing her work as fast as she could accomplish it. But she dug again, widening the passage, keeping the entrance open, because she knew with a certainty that went beyond logic that the Brennans would not be the last. They came throughout the day. The Kowalski widow arrived at mid-morning, dragging her 2 small boys through drifts that reached their chests. Her farmhouse had not collapsed, but the fire had gone out in the night, and she could not get it restarted, and the cold was seeping in through every crack and crevice. The Morgan family came at noon, 6 people in all, parents and 4 children, ranging in age from 3 to 14. Their barn had collapsed under the weight of the snow, killing 3 of their cows and trapping the rest. They had spent hours digging out the surviving animals before realizing that the house itself was in danger. The Petersons came in the early afternoon. The O'Connors came at dusk. More families followed, emerging from the white wilderness like ghosts drawn to the quarry by desperation and rumor and the simple human need to survive. Lenora met each group at the tunnel entrance, helped them down the stairs, settled them into whatever space she could find. The shelter filled first, then the storage building, then the goat pen. People sat on the floor, leaned against the walls, huddled together for warmth that they no longer needed because the quarry provided it for free. By nightfall, there were 23 people at the bottom of the pit. By the morning of the 4th day, there were 31. The quarry had become a village. Lenora organized them with an efficiency that surprised everyone, including herself. She divided the refugees into work crews based on their abilities and strength. The strongest men were assigned to dig out the entrance tunnel each morning, keeping the path clear so more survivors could descend. The women with cooking experience took over the preparation of food, stretching Lenore's stores with whatever supplies the refugees had brought with them. The older children watched the younger ones, keeping them occupied and out of the way while the adults worked. The system evolved organically, shaped by necessity and the cramped conditions of the quarry floor. People who had been strangers above ground became partners in survival below. They shared blankets and food and stories, huddled together against a disaster that would have killed them all if they had faced it alone. There were conflicts, of course. 31 people in a space meant for one will always find reasons to argue. The Kowalski boys fought with the Morgan children over a wooden toy. Patrick Brennan and Thomas Peterson nearly came to blows over the rationing of firewood. Mrs. O'Connor complained loudly and frequently about the smell of the goats. But the conflicts were small and they were resolved quickly because everyone understood the alternative. Outside the quarry, the storm raged on. Outside the quarry, people were dying. Inside the quarry, they were alone, and staying alive required cooperation. The spring that bubbled up at the quarry's edge became the center of daily life. It provided fresh water that never froze, emerging from deep in the earth, where temperature stayed constant, regardless of what the weather did on the surface. Women gathered there to fill buckets and wash clothes and exchange whispered conversations about husbands and children and fears they could not voice aloud. The fire became another gathering point, a source of warmth and light and comfort. Families took turns tending it, keeping it burning steady through the night, managing the heat so the shelter stayed warm without wasting wood. The firelight flickered on the granite walls, casting shadows that danced like spirits, creating a sense of intimacy and closeness that the people above ground had never experienced. In the evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, the adults gathered around the fire and talked. They talked about the storm and the destruction it was causing. They talked about their farms and their families and their fears for the future. They talked about Lenora, about how she had built this refuge, about what it meant that she had saved them. And they talked about Horace Pembroke, and his house is on the hill, Thomas Peterson said on the 4th night. Finest house in the valley. He always bragged about how solid it was, how it could withstand anything. Pride goes before a fall, Mrs. O'Connor said. My mother always said that. Do you think he's alive? Ruth Brennan asked. No one answered. No one knew. And in the silence, Lenora thought about the man who had tried to buy her quarry for $12. The man who had called her husband a fool. The man who had predicted her failure with such certainty, such contempt. She wondered if he was warm tonight. The 32nd refugee arrived on the morning of the 4th day. Lenora was at the tunnel entrance supervising the morning dig-out when she saw a figure staggering through the snow. It was moving erratically, stumbling and falling and rising again, making slow progress toward the quarry through drifts that seemed determined to swallow it whole. As the figure drew closer, she recognized the silver hair, the fine coat now torn and filthy, the bearing of a man accustomed to being in control, now reduced to desperation. Horace Pembroke. He collapsed at the edge of the tunnel, his face a mask of frostbite and exhaustion. His lips were blue. His fingers, ungloved, were white with the early stages of frostbite. His eyes, when they found Lenora's face, held none of the contempt she remembered. They held only fear. Mrs. Whitmore. His voice was a croak barely audible above the wind. I know I have no right to ask. Lenore looked down at the man who had caused her so much pain. The man who had sold her husband a trap knowing it would fail. The man who had circled like a vulture waiting for her to give up so he could snatch away everything she had worked for. He was dying. She could see it in the blue of his lips, the white of his fingers, the trembling that racked his body. Another hour in the storm, and he would be dead. Another hour, and the man who had called her quarry worthless would be just another body buried in the snow. She could let it happen. No one would blame her. No one would even know. She could turn away, go back down into the warmth, and let the storm do what the storm was doing to so many others. The thought lasted only a moment. Come down, she said. There's room. Pembroke stared at her. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Something shifted in his face, some expression she could not read. Then he nodded a small, jerky movement, and he let her help him into the tunnel. The descent was slow. Pembroke could barely walk, his legs numb from hours of struggling through the snow. Lenora half carried him down the wooden stairs, his weight heavy against her shoulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. At the bottom, the other refugees turned to watch. They saw the silver hair, the fine coat, the face they all recognized. The quarry fell silent. Lenora helped Pembroke to a spot near the fire, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, pressed a cup of warm water into his frozen hands. He drank mechanically, his eyes fixed on the flames, seeing nothing. No one greeted him. No one offered words of welcome. The people he had cheated, the families he had manipulated, the lives he had damaged, over years of predatory dealing, they all watched in silence as he sat by the fire, shivering alive only because of the woman he had tried to destroy. Patrick Brennan moved closer to Lenora, his voice low. You're letting him stay. Would you have me throw him back into the storm? Patrick's jaw tightened. He looked at Pembroke, at the pathetic figure huddled by the fire, and his expression was complicated. Anger was there certainly, but also something else. Something that might have been respect for a woman who could show mercy to her enemy. No, he said finally, I wouldn't have you do that. He walked away, and Lenora returned to the entrance to continue the morning dig-out. Pembroke barely spoke for the first day. He sat in his corner of the shelter, wrapped in blankets, watching the activity around him with eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing. The refugees moved past him as if he were furniture, acknowledging his presence only to the extent necessary, offering neither kindness nor cruelty. He ate what was given to him. He drank what was offered. He slept when exhaustion overcame him, but he did not participate in the life of the quarry, did not join the work crews or help with the children or contribute to the endless tasks that kept 32 people by even a hole in the ground. On the second day of his residence, he began to watch Lenora. He watched her organize the food distribution, making sure everyone received a fair share. He watched her settle disputes between families, finding compromises that satisfied no one completely, but kept the peace. He watched her climb the stairs each morning to dig out the entrance, returning hours later, with her arms trembling from exhaustion. He watched, and something in his expression changed. On the evening of his second day, he approached her. She was sitting by the fire, repairing a tear in one of the children's coats, her needle moving with the practiced ease of a former seamstress. She looked up as his shadow fell across her work, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Why? He asked finally. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual polish. Why what? Why did you let me in, after everything I did, after everything I said? He paused, and she could see the struggle in his face, the difficulty of confronting questions he had never had to ask before. You had every reason to let me die. Lenora set down the coat and looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time since he had arrived. She saw the frostbite on his cheeks, still healing. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the confusion, the fear. She saw a man whose entire world had collapsed, not just his house, but his understanding of how the world worked. "You asked if you could come in," she said. "You asked, and I said yes. That's all." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." She picked up the coat, again resumed her stitching. "I don't have time for grudges, Mr. Pembroke. I have 32 people depending on me for survival. I have a storm that won't end and supplies that won't last forever and a hole in the ground that somehow has to keep everyone alive until spring. Whatever you did to me, whatever you did to my husband, it doesn't matter right now. What matters is making it through the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that." Pembroke was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly and turned away. But later that night, when the quarry had settled into the restless sleep of too many people in too small a space, Lenora saw him helping Indiz O'Connor carry water from the spring. It was a small thing, but it was something. The storm broke on the morning of February 8th. Lenora climbed the stairs at dawn, expecting another day of digging, another day of gray skies and howling wind. Instead, she emerged from the tunnel into a world transformed by light. The sun hung in a sky of perfect blue, blazing down on a landscape that had been remade by the storm. The valley was buried under 12 feet of snow, a smooth white expanse broken only by the dark shapes of trees and the occasional chimney poking up from where a house used to be. She stood on the platform and stared, unable to fully comprehend what she was seeing. The church was gone. Not collapsed, but simply gone, buried so completely that not even its steeple was visible. The general store had caved in its roof, a shattered ruin barely visible above the drifts. The school, the blacksmith shop, the row of houses along the main street, all of them were either destroyed or buried. And beyond the village, the farms. House after house, reduced to snow-covered mounds, their chimneys cold and dead. The valley had been devastated, but the quarry was untouched. The granite walls rose from the snow like something eternal, indifferent to the storm that had destroyed everything built by human hands. The platform was clear, the stairs were passable. The tunnel she had dug each morning was no longer necessary because the wind had stopped and the snow had stopped falling. Lenora stood in the sunlight and wept. She wept for the valley, for the destruction, for the lives that had been lost and the homes that had been destroyed. She wept for the people who had not made it to the quarry, who had frozen in their beds or been crushed by their collapsing roofs, or simply disappeared into the white wilderness, never to be seen again. And she wept for herself, for the relief that flooded through her, for the knowledge that she had survived, that the people in her care had survived, that the quarry she had built had done exactly what she had hoped it would do. She wiped her eyes and descended the stairs to wake the others. They emerged slowly, blinking in the brilliant sunlight, unable to process the world they found. Some wept when they saw their homes, or what remained of them. The Morgans stood in silence, looking at the snow-covered mound that had been their farmhouse, their faces blank with shock. The Petersons held each other, trembling, as they realized that the barn they had spent 20 years building was simply gone. Others laughed the hysterical laughter of people who had survived something unsurvivable. The O'Connor children ran through the snow, throwing handfuls at each other, their voices bright and clear in the cold air. Ruth Brennan stood at the edge of the quarry, her face turned to the sun, her eyes closed, drinking in the warmth. Horace Pembroke climbed out last. He stood apart from the others, looking out at the devastation with an expression that was difficult to read. His fine house on the hill was visible in the distance, or at least the chimney was. The rest had been swallowed by the snow, buried as completely as the church and the general store and all the other buildings that had been supposed to last. Lenora watched him, wondering what he was thinking. He turned and caught her eye, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Two people who had been enemies, who had been thrown together by circumstance, who had survived something that should have killed them both. "I owe you my life," he said. His voice was quiet, meant for her ears alone. "I don't know how to repay a debt like that. You don't owe me anything. I owe you everything." He paused, and when he spoke again, His voice was even quieter. I owe your husband everything. The quarry I called worthless saved my life. The flooded pit I tried to buy for $12 saved 32 people from freezing to death. He shook his head slowly. I was wrong. About everything. About the quarry, about you, about what has value and what doesn't. Lenora did not know what to say. She had expected many things from Horace Pembroke, but not this, not humility, not admission of error, not the sight of a proud man confronting his own failings. What will you do now, she asked. Rebuild, I suppose. Everyone will rebuild. That's what people do. He looked at the quarry, at the granite walls rising from the snow. But I won't forget what happened here. I won't forget what you built or what it meant. He walked away, joining the other refugees as they began the long process of digging out and starting over. Lenora watched him go, then turned back to the quarry. Her quarry, the worthless pit that had saved 32 lives. She wondered what Tobias would have thought if he could have seen this day. If he could have known that his dream, the dream that had cost him his life, had become something greater than either of them had imagined. She touched the ring that hung around her neck, feeling its warmth against her chest. We did it, she whispered. We built something that mattered. The granite walls absorbed her words and held them patient as always, waiting for whatever came next. The weeks that followed were chaos. The survivors scattered to assess the damage, to search for missing neighbors, to begin the overwhelming task of digging out and rebuilding. The snow was too deep for horses, too deep for wagons, too deep for any of the normal methods of transportation and commerce. People traveled on foot, struggling through drifts that reached their waists, their hips, sometimes their chests. The death toll mounted as bodies were discovered. Old Mr. Hendricks frozen in his bed. The Carpenter family, all 6 of them, crushed when their roof collapsed. The minister and his wife buried in the parsonage when a drift slid off the mountainside and swallowed their house whole. 37 people had survived in the quarry. Across the valley, 43 had died. Lenora kept the quarry open as a refuge for those who needed it. Families whose homes were destroyed and individuals who had nowhere else to go. People who simply could not face another night in the frozen wreckage of their former lives. They came and went as their circumstances required, and she welcomed them all. The stories spread. They spread through the valley, then beyond, carried by travelers and traders, and the simple human need to share remarkable things. The story of the widow who had drained a flooded quarry. The story of the shelter she had built at the bottom. The story of the 37 people who had survived the worst blizzard in Vermont history because one woman had refused to accept that a hole in the ground was worthless. People came from other valleys, other towns, other counties, just to see the quarry for themselves. They descended the wooden stairs and stood on the granite floor and looked at the shelter in the storage building, in the goat pen, and they shook their heads in wonder. How did you know? They asked. How did you know it would work? I didn't know, Lenora always answered. I just didn't have any other choice. It was the truth and it was not the truth. She had known on some level that the quarry could be more than a flooded pit. She had seen what Tobias saw, felt what he felt, understood the potential hidden beneath the dark water. She had trusted that vision when everyone else called it foolish, and the vision had proven true. But she also understood that knowing and doing were different things. Knowing the quarry could be drained was meaningless without the will to drain it. Knowing a shelter could be built was worthless without the strength to build it. Vision without action was just daydreaming. Action without vision was just labor. She had found the place where vision and action met, and she had refused to leave until the work was done. That, more than anything else, was why 37 people were alive. Old Salvatore came to the quarry on the first day of April. The snow was finally melting, revealing the devastation that the blizzard had hidden for nearly 2 months. Roads were reappearing. Fields were emerging from beneath the white blanket. The valley was slowly, painfully returning to something like normal. Salvatore had survived the storm in his shack at the edge of the village. The shack was small and poorly built, but it had one advantage that the finer houses lacked. It was too insignificant for the snow to crush. The drifts had simply covered it, creating an insulating layer that kept the old man warm while the wind howled outside. He descended the stairs slowly, his joints protesting every step, his breath coming in wheezes that spoke of lungs damaged by decades of stone dust. At the bottom, he stood for a long moment, looking at everything Lenore had built. The shelter against the north wall solid and snug. The storage building against the south wall nearly empty, now but still standing. The goat pen against the east wall, the animals healthy despite the long winter. The chimney that drew perfectly the stairs that descended in their careful zigzag, the platform that blocked rain and snow